Right. Okay. So assuming everyone can see that, shout if you can't. So yeah, thank you very much for the kind of the invite to actually come and speak today. It's really great that we've got a whole day of people just talking about automation. It's definitely part of the modern world. Everything can be automated. Everything should be automated. To give us that confidence in building our solutions. So today we're going to be going through keyless authentication using Azure Managed Identity. So I joined the other session, Sean's session, which was great, and he actually mentioned, managed identity has been kind of mentioned a few times today. This session really is kind of it's a little bit of a deep dive, but I've got some examples of what managed identity is there for, how you can use it, how you can get up and running very quickly as well. So maybe you've heard managed identity, you've seen some examples, but you just want to kind of get started, then hopefully this session is going to be for you. So as I was kind of saying, so a little bit about myself. So my name is Gary Trinder. So I'm a solutions architect based in the UK. I work for a company called CPS, who are at the other end of the country. So, modern workplace is great. I'm about 3 hours drive away from my actual office. But, I get to work and do everything in 365. So I'm an office development MVP as well. So I was awarded in January of last year. So I've been around as an MVP for about a year, but I've been around in the community for a lot longer than that. I'm a member of the Microsoft 365 Patterns and Practices team, and as I was mentioning, a lot of that kind of comes from my work around the CLI for Microsoft 365 tool, of which I'm part of the maintainer team. There are a number of us now looking after that, so working a lot in the open source community as well. So I'm on Twitter quite a lot, so you can follow me on Twitter at Gary Trinder. I've got the same name on GitHub as well, so if you want to check out my GitHub profile, and there's signposts to my blog as well. And I blog time to time about different things that I find, but I also I'm part of a podcast as well. So Grey Hatbeard podcast is a Microsoft 365 Modern Workplace podcast that I do with two of my colleagues, Kevin McDonnell and Alan Erdley. We record like a couple of times a week, and we just kind of basically have a good chat about the things that have been happening across all Microsoft 365. So that might be Power Platform, it might be Azure, anything that week. We discuss that, and we get some guests on as well. So if that's interests you, check us out on all the podcast systems that are out there. So I'm just going to quickly run through kind of what I'm going to go through. So, first, what problem we're solving? What is managed identity here for? Why does it exist? Kind of a bit of a think about how we manage credentials at the moment. I'm going to dive into managed identity and the different types of identities that you can use, and then I've got a few demos. So I'm going to use some logic apps, a few scenarios which I want to kind of run through and just explain what's really going on behind the scenes as well, so you have an understanding of what managed identity is actually doing. It is a bit magic, but you can understand what is actually happening, and then a wrap up at the end. So managing credentials. So, I think everyone who's in the session at the moment, this is always a problem that you need to solve. You, especially working with the cloud, you need some credentials to connect and authenticate to different APIs, databases, all those kinds of systems. So, that's one of the problems that you need to solve, right? How are you going to manage those credentials? They're important, right? They give you access to important data, and data is the most important thing in the world, as we keep getting told. Data is the new gold, so we need to make sure that that's protected. And we don't want to be, putting credentials in code and storing that away in source code and having things on our machine. So that is a tricky kind of problem to solve. To add to that, we've also got this problem of, well, okay, I've got my keys now and I've got my credentials, but how am I managing the expiry of those? How do I renew them? What is the process that I need to go through that is going to help me renew all my credentials to use to connect to my systems? And the kind of the problem that people generally face when using Key Vault for the first time is obviously Azure Key Vault is there to store away securely credentials and secrets and certificates. But how do you actually connect to it with credentials? And where do you store those credentials? You can't actually store them in another Key Vault and then you have another key. Do you just have a master key locked away somewhere that you can access everything with? So yeah, this problem exists, and it's real, and it can have some big problems if you don't manage your credentials correctly. So this is where Azure Managed Identity comes in, or rather, I like to call it Azure Managed Identity. It isn't actually called Azure Managed Identity. It is called Managed Identities for Azure Resources. That's how Microsoft actually term it, and it was actually a rename. So originally they were called Managed Service Identities as well. For the purpose of this talk, I'm just going to go with Azure Managed Identity because it's a lot easier to understand and to say as well. So what this gives us is basically a way of authenticating with any Azure AD backed service. That could be an API, it could be a SQL Server database that's got Azure AD turned on, but effectively any Azure AD service we can use this with. And what this allows us to do is to basically connect without sending any credentials. We don't need to store that credential in any code. We don't need to store this in a Key Vault anywhere. As the term managed kind of alludes itself to, Microsoft is taking all of that responsibility for us. They're saying, you don't need to deal with this anymore. We're gonna handle this scenario for you. And what's really nice is by going down the managed identity route, you get this automatic credential rolling as well. Even though you don't have a credential or a key to pass to a particular service, Microsoft is still doing those cycles behind the scenes. So you don't have to worry about things becoming stale. Is something going to expire? Do I need to put a reminder into the service desk or whatever to just make sure that they've gone in and updated a credential? A massive thing is the fact that it's free. You get this at no additional cost. It's based on Azure AD. You don't have to have premium or anything like that. So you can just go and use it straight away. And another thing which I really like is that it uses role-based access control to say, I want this service or this resource in Azure to be able to connect to a particular system, and it's based on those roles, and that's really nice. When you get into it, it's very simple to set up. So in this, I like to take a Back to the Future kind of term. Where we're going, we don't need credentials, and that is the crux of managed identity. So when we're talking about managed identity, there's actually two distinct managed identities available to you. The first is the system assigned identity. Now, this can be enabled directly on an actual Azure service. So let's say, for example, you have an Azure function and you enable a system assigned managed identity. That identity can only be used with that resource. You can't use it with anything else. One of the I guess this could be a good thing, could be a bad thing, is that the life cycle of that identity is tied directly to that resource. So if anyone goes in and deletes the Azure function that has a system identity assigned to it, it will automatically remove that from Azure AD, and it will tidy itself up. In contrast, a user assigned managed identity is something that stands alone. It's actually quite visible in the Azure Portal, is that you actually create an Azure assigned managed identity as a resource. So like you would go and create an Azure function or a logic app, and that would show up in a resource group. You do the same for a user assigned managed identity. And the big difference here is that this can then be shared. So let's say you've got an application and you use a number of logic apps and a number of functions, and you want them all to use the same identity and assign permissions to that particular identity and reuse that across all of them. Then you'd use a user assigned managed identity. Now, because it's independent from the resources that it's being used on, that life cycle is not dependent on those resources. So if you delete the logic apps or the functions that use it, the identity will still stay there. So it's just one thing to know that if you need to tidy those up, that's a manual task. So with that, I'm going to jump into a demo, very simple demo. I'm going to basically access the Key Vault by setting up a managed a system assigned identity on a logic app, and we're going to go to the Key Vault and we're basically going to return a secret. So if I come out of my presentation and go to my Azure Portal. Oh yeah, one thing to call out, so I can put this link in the chat. So there is some good documentation around managed identity. So basically, this just kind of explains what I've just said about those life cycles, where you can use them and things. But it's a really good resource if you wanted to get into using managed identity across Azure AD. It's a very good place to start. Okay, so so I'm in the Azure Portal. I'm hoping the size of the text and everything is fine. Please shout out in the chat if you need me to make it any bigger. But I've got a few things already set up in here. I've got my Key Vault. So let's just go into here and I'll show the secrets that I have. So I've got a super secret. You can see I've got a secret in here, which then I can go and see. So see, okay, that's there, but it's all encrypted away, right? It's all safely tucked away in the Key Vault. So what we're actually going to do is create a logic app to access that. So logic. And let's create this. Don't need anything else. So review and create that. So it's just going to go away and quickly provision it. Which it now has done. Get rid of the designer first of all. Right, okay, so here's our logic app that we're going to use. On the left-hand side, under settings, we've got identity. So this is where we can actually come in and we can create the different identities. So first of all, I'm just going to turn this on. And I'm going to hit save. And it's basically saying, actually, this identity is going to be registered with your Active Directory. Obviously, once it's registered, it can then be granted permissions to access resources protected by Azure AD. In this scenario, we're going to grant that that identity access to the Key Vault. So I'm going to click yes. Okay, so this has now shown that we've got our managed identity set up and we can manage permissions here. What I'm actually going to do though is I'm going to quickly jump into Azure Active Directory and show you where that lives. If I go into Enterprise Applications and I called it LA. Yeah, so this is the one. I've got some other ones set up in my tenant, but this is the one that I just created. And you can see in here that that has all been provisioned. It doesn't have permissions or anything, but effectively what this has done, this has actually gone in and created a special type of service principal in your Azure AD environment. And because it's system assigned identity, it takes the name of the resource that it's assigned to as well. So it's fairly easy to come into here and see, which resources have had managed identity turned on. So let's skip back to the resource group. I just realized I'm still in Active Directory. Yeah. If I go to the Logic app. Okay, so we're in the Logic app. So actually, I want to go into the Key Vault. That was the wrong thing to do. We're going to basically grant the identity access. So in the Key Vault, we can go down into policies, and we can add an access policy. I just want to grant get on the secrets. I can then choose service principal. So I can pull out the service principal that I created beforehand. So I can select that. So this is now the role-based access that it's setting up. So I'm going to add that as a new policy, which there says we've got an application. Which is good to know is that this as a service, a system assigned managed identity and managed identity in general is application based. So we're not doing delegate authentication here. So I'm just going to save this access policy. You can see it's got get on the secrets, and then I'm going to go back to my Logic app, which is this one. And this time go into the designer. And start with a blank one. So I'm just going to use a schedule just to give us a starting point here. Just put that up a bit. So from the HTTP action, what we're going to do is we're going to do a GET request to the Key Vault. So just paste this in. So this is the name of the Key Vault, and this is the effectively the API that we are calling. I am going to define an API version in the header because that is what we also need. So this is the request that we need to actually access that secret. So one of the things that we can do in here, we can actually turn on authentication on HTTP. It's a bit weird. You have to click off to get the option after you've selected it. Now in here, we've got the option for managed identity, and it automatically picked the managed identity here for what we need. And what I'm going to do is put the audience in as well. And I'm going to hit save. And let's run that. Oops. Hang on. That was a bad example. I think I've added the, I didn't need the audience. Oh dear. This is the demo gods. I think I've probably just not added the policy correctly. Let me just go back and change that. just make sure that that is correct and that has gone on and that's saved. Yeah. There we go. Apologies, everyone. It did have access. It was the wrong audience. Okay, let's run and save that. Expected that. Well, this is a turn up for the books. This is the demo that should work every single time. And I've never seen it fail until today. API version must be specified, which it is. I have a feeling that Logic Apps is playing up today. Let's just double check. Copy. Actually. Just double check. I may have got the wrong one. There we go, finally. Apologies for that, folks. So yeah, it's actually gone through and it's communicated, it's authenticated, it's returned our actual value. So it's gone in and got our secret. So from a Logic App perspective, this would be great if you're then wanting to get credentials to actually then call like a downstream service. That might be an on-premises application that is not using Azure AD and it's using a different level authentication. So what I want to do is just jump back to the slides and just kind of show what actually happened there in the background. So I've got this flow chart. So I'm going to jump through the different numbers. So from point number one, when we enabled the managed identity on our Logic app, it connected to the Azure resource manager. It basically told it that you need to go and create a new service principal in Azure AD. So that's where the service principal that I showed you was created. That's fairly straightforward. What it also does is it updates this Azure instance metadata service. And that effectively says that, yeah, this is something that can be used to authenticate with from within inside Azure. So it's kind of trusted. The fourth point is basically assigning the permissions. So in this case, we assigned the access to the Key Vault to get the secrets. So that is based in the Azure role-based access control. And then when we actually requested a token. So when we set up the Logic app and said, I want you to use managed identity, when that request was made, when it went to get the access token, it actually went to a local endpoint within Azure. So it's like an actual local host kind of port that obviously we can't call because we're not on in the data center. And that handles requesting that token from Azure AD using our managed identity, and then it passes that on to the request that then goes off to Key Vault or any other Azure AD backed service. So that's how it's working in the background. That's how it's able to get those tokens. So actually what you can do is if you are, let's say you're on an Azure VM, if you're in Azure VM and you're in remote desktop, you're inside Azure, you can actually call that local service to get a token back as well. Don't have an example of that at the moment, but that is possible. But I do have an example actually in my GitHub repository, so that's available if anyone needs it. So I'm going to move on to the next demo. This is slightly different. So this is calling the Graph API. And what I'm going to do is going to use the user assigned managed identity just to kind of show you how that works and how to grant our service principal permissions to the graph. I noticed actually on a few of the sessions, it was all PowerShell based. The scripts, and I've been there before, they're not the greatest. You have to kind of jump around and get bits of information. I'm going to show you how we've simplified that using CLI for Microsoft 365 into one very simple command to grant access. So let's jump out of here and let's go into the Azure Portal again. Hopefully I will have my luck this time. So let's jump in and quickly just create our logic app. I think I can do it quickly from up here. So we're going to add, no, let's go the other way. Oh. So there we go. Create that. Put that in our resource group. And let's create that. Okay, let's go to the logic app and back down into the managed identity. And this time we're going to go to user assigned instead. So there's a big difference here. With user assigned, we can't actually just create one from this screen. We actually have to create it as a resource. Unlike on the system assigned identity, we just had a nice switch and it kind of went away and did that. So what I'm just going to do is I'll use this screen here and go create a resource. So like I was saying, this is a resource in its own right. So you create it and give it a name. So I want this to be in the same location. And I shall give it a name. And I will create that. So go to the resource. So there's not much on here apart from it just being kind of the properties of the user assigned managed identity. But if I go back to the resource group that I had, if I refresh that, there we go. So now our managed identity lives alongside our resources in our resource group. So it's nice and easy to see if anyone's coming along to this. Oh, we've already got a managed identity that we can use. It's not hidden away in the in Azure AD. So if I go back to my logic app now, I can add this as an identity. So again, I've got a few of these. Choose this one and add that. Okay, so this one is now added. And what I was saying before, we want to grant this access to the graph. So when we looked in Azure AD previously, we go here. So a system assigned managed identity is tied and has the name of the resource, whereas basically it's still creating a service principal, but it's under the name of whatever you give the name of the user assigned managed identity. So I can come into here. Now, one of the things that you're probably used to is if you're doing anything with applications, you tend to create an app registration and assign that app registration permissions to call a graph. If we come down here into permissions, this is actually all grayed out. We can't actually come into here and say through the user interface, I want to grant access to for this identity to have access to a particular scope on the graph. So this is where the scripts come in, and you might have seen this on other sessions using PowerShell. As I mentioned, I help maintain the CLI for Microsoft 365. We like using managed identity, so we basically aim to make this as simple as possible. So I have the CLI for Microsoft 365 already installed. If I just hit M365, you'll see that the CLI is here. There we are. So I've got a version on my machine. I'll actually just jump and show you where you can get the documentation from. And I will pop this in the chat as well. So I'll just pop that into the chat. So here we've got all the information of how to install it, how to use it. Please take a look if it interests you. I'm just going to show you how quickly we can just log in and grant a scope to our managed identity. So one of the commands that we provide is this Azure Active Directory command for app role assignments. I'm just going to show you the interactive help for this. So we actually call out in the description, which is down here. This command can be used to assign permissions to system or user assigned identities. And you can see that we can just accept a display name, the resource, and one or many scopes that we want to grant to that principal. So we're going to use this to grant access to basically groups scope. So what I first need to do is I just need to log into my tenant. I'm going to use device code login for this. And go to the device login page. I've just seen a question in the chat of, is managed identity available for build release management in Azure DevOps? Yes, it is. I've not personally used it yet, but it is an option in the user interface. So yeah, that definitely can be used. So I've just logged in to my tenant using the CLI. So I'll go back to the terminal. So just to confirm that I'm actually logged in, I'll just look at the status. And let's go back to our command. So I'm going to add in the display name, which is, I'll just make sure I get this correct. Which is this one. And the resource is going to be Microsoft Graph. Whoops, somehow I managed to hit a key there whilst I was typing. Apologies for that. Again, Microsoft Graph and the scope that we want to give it, which is going to be group read all. Now this is where I could get it wrong because I always forget whether if it's group or groups. Nope, that one worked. So that's just a confirmation that this scope has now been added. So if I go back into here, we can now see that we have the read all groups permission and that it was obviously granted by an administrator. So that's how you can manage your permissions if you want to be calling other APIs, and that could be SharePoint, it could be any Microsoft 365 service, and it's a nice, quick, and easy way to give yourself application based permissions without then having to deal with certificates. So let's go back now to our Logic app. So let's go into the graph one. So use another schedule. Add another HTTP. Okay, so we're going to do a quick GET request, and this is going to be another simple one. We are going to basically just return all the groups from the groups endpoint. We're running as admin, therefore we've got all that access. So let's close this. Back into authentication again on here, click off, and we've got our managed identity. This time we've actually got the option of choosing our user assigned managed identity as well, because this has obviously been assigned to this resource, so I can select that. Obviously, good benefit of using this user assigned managed identity is the fact that if I've got multiple Logic apps, they can all use the same identity, and then they've all been given the same permissions as well. One thing in this one, which caught me in the last one, so the audience needs to be the graph. If this was calling SharePoint, then it would need to be the SharePoint tenant URL as the audience as well. So I'm going to hit save. I'm going to hit run. And there we go, nice and fast. And we can confirm that, it's returned all the groups in there, can then use that for processing. It becomes a nice, easy way, again, of just getting something set up and working quickly, especially with absolutely no code as well. We could use Azure functions and everything like that. I absolutely love this approach for doing proof of concepts. I can get a design set up, understand what calls I need to make very quickly using a Logic app, and then I can make the decision to actually write some code if needs be, maybe for cost optimization point of view. But this is a really nice, easy way of having those two options and flexibility with the two different types of managed identity. I've just seen a question about, so if will internal managed identity API calls add up to the computing cost of the various Azure resources? That is a very interesting question. I've never seen that question before. I can be honest, I don't actually know. I wouldn't suspect so, because it's just normal kind of authentication, but yeah, don't quote me on that. I've not seen any kind of real hikes in cost by using it this approach, so yeah, I don't think that that is a particular issue. Just quickly jump back to the slides. So we've done that demo. So the final one I just want to close off with is how you'd use this from an Azure function. So I have an Azure function here. So I've actually already published this into Azure, but I just wanted to quickly just basically run through the code and the easy way of being able to have a code approach from what we've just shown. So what I have is an auth class, which basically uses this NuGet package, which I think Sean kind of mentioned in the previous session. But you can basically install this from NuGet, and it gives us this ability to create a new Azure Service Token provider and pass in a connection string. So as a connection string, this is just going to run in Azure. So all we need to do is give it the runners app connection string, which means just going to use the app only connections. I've added something into here which does allow you to use this locally. So I've not got a demo of this, but it's something that I want to kind of blog about. Is obviously if you're debugging locally, you're not connected to Azure. How do you actually debug and code against your environment? Well, you can kind of trick the Azure function by passing certificate details, and there's a process that you can go through to create a service principal, set all that up in your environment, and then basically reuse the thumbprint information. So when the NuGet package goes and gets the token, rather than getting it locally from Azure, because we've passed this connection string in, it goes, I'm actually going to use a certificate that's local on your machine. And again, a nice easy way of doing that is we can just define the configuration settings in a config file and then just swap that out. And we don't need to persist that to source control either, because it's you shouldn't do basically. So one of the things about this is if you're using managed identity and you want to take this approach, then do it against your dev environments first. It's definitely the way for this. Otherwise, your admins may be unhappy. But essentially, what it does, it gets this provider and it gives us the option to get the access token async. So in previous example, we were going to the graph and making a call. So this accepts the audience value to make those calls. We set up a HTTP client, which adds in the access token, which is returned, and then we can send our request to the endpoint that we want to call, and then return the response back as JSON. So let's quickly see this in the portal. So I've already got my function set up. I've already had this actually deployed. And if I go to identity, I've already set up the identity, and I've already granted that access in the same way as what we did before to grant this the group read all. So I'm not going to go into that again. I'm just going to show you it running. If I go back to the function and go into here, so there is my function name. I'm just going to test that. Test and run. So I'm not going to pass anything. It's maybe a little bit slow because it needs to fire up, but effectively it's done the same thing. It's got the same response. Again, it's used managed identity, a system assigned managed identity to go and get that information. So just to kind of back up what I was saying about what was happening in the background, I've actually got app insights set up on this function. And I'm hoping, sometimes this can be a little bit slow, is which one is it? Yeah, I think it's application map. Oh, there we go. It's not quite updated yet. Whoops. Yeah, it's not quite updated yet, and I'm kind of running to the time. But essentially, if you've got app insights in there, it actually show you nice and graphically when it's making the calls to the local endpoint as well to get the tokens. So you see it kind of firing off and making those other calls just to confirm that it is actually using that identity. But if we jump back to the code, I mean, this is a very simple way of setting it up. It's very straightforward. So Joel's just asked a question, can you get full access to the SharePoint API using managed identity? I thought this had some limitations. The PnP PowerShell documentation seems to align. So are you doing something different on the CLI? So in the CLI, all we're doing is we're just mapping the app role assignments on the Azure AD. In terms of calling SharePoint, it's effectively the same as well, it is the same as doing certificate authentication. So in the background, when that service principal is created, it actually creates a certificate and stores it away in Azure. I can go into the detail. There's a manifest file that actually gives you all that information. But essentially, it's doing certificate authentication for you in the background. So SharePoint Online does support certificate authentication. I don't think we're doing anything necessarily special in the CLI to set up the permissions. All we're doing is we've just made it a simpler process than having to deal with some of the Azure PowerShell modules, which you have to kind of know where you're going to get the information that you need. We've just made that simpler. So I'm going to jump back to the slide. So just in summary, so we've seen that we don't need to store any credentials to authenticate, and we can let Azure handle that credential management for us at no extra cost, which is fantastic. It really simplifies those app-only scenarios as well, like I've shown. So if calling the graph or calling SharePoint, that's made super simple. You can use CLI for Microsoft 365 to update those app role assignments. Again, that's something nice and easy that can be used. There is one thing to call out though as well. So when I ran that command to actually update the app role assignments, because that's making a change in Azure AD, what I've found is that you need to have an Azure Global Admin role to actually change that. So if you're in your dev environment, generally you're going to be the global admin, and that will be fine. It's just something as you move into production to basically make a note of. If you don't manage that environment and you've got an administrator that needs to do this for you, then you'll need to get them to do that. There is another thing to note as well. So the permissions are locked after its first use. So if I just add the managed identity, the group read all, and then I want to increase it to read write, you can add the extra roles, but because that first request didn't have those scopes, you don't get them added. So you have to undo the work that you've done to add new ones. So really think about how what permissions you need when setting these up. And we've also seen for Azure Functions, if you want to get into the code, the Microsoft Azure Services App Authentication package really helps out and simplifies that story from the code perspective. So the samples that I've got here, so I've got a GitHub repository that's got a number of examples. There's actually one of doing it kind of using Azure Identity manually from an Azure VM and all the setup. So if you want to know more, check out that repository. And just kind of thinking of the next project that you're using, or maybe you've got a project that's ongoing and you're maybe not using managed identity, you're thinking, well, actually, we could simplify a lot of things here. So, just have a think about things that you're working on right now that actually this could benefit from to really simplify your authentication story. And with that, I'll say thank you very much. And I guess any questions, fire them in the chat. I can see Joel has fired another question in here. Do you need to manage the certificate that gets stored behind the scenes, like renewing it? No. So that is again, a great benefit of managed identity is that that certificate, although you never see it, that's automatically rolled by Microsoft. So they actually roll it. I think they say it can be up to 60 days, and then they'll automatically roll it, because obviously you don't need the credentials to actually pass. You don't actually need to change anything. So it will automatically just start working. So yeah, I've used these in production scenarios, and they just run and they update themselves, which is fantastic. It's one less thing you need to manage.
Thank you, Gary. What a fantastic, highly useful session there, really. A lot of people didn't realize, obviously, you could use all of these features. So it's going to really make our lives a lot easier, and definitely. So a lot of people don't think about using these features that you talked about today, Gary. We go about the long route. So I think it's been highly valuable. So I just want to say thank you. And a lot of the attendees are saying thank you there, David and Coquelin and Dias and Joel. We all appreciate this. Really, really good session. Thanks again, Gary, and also for doing the hands-on labs as well. I know it's not easy. Things don't always work due to connectivity and things like that. And but that was great. Honestly, we learned a lot from it. As I did as well. So I want to say thank you once again, Gary. So you've shared your contact details there. That's your Twitter. Could you share your personal contact details in the chat window as well, just so that people can connect with you?
Yeah, sure. So the best place is on here. So my GitHub profile has access to everything. It's got my Twitter, blog, and everything. So I've just put that in the chat. So basically reach out to me. Happy to answer any questions. In fact, the repository that I just mentioned is there. It's pinned alongside the CLI for Microsoft 365 as well. So you'll get everything in one place.
Fantastic. That's really, really great.